Hello, and welcome to all of you who have joined us for this interview, which is part of the Pembroke Speaker Series at Cambridge Judge in International Finance. This speaker series features some globally prominent experts in the field of international finance. I'm Christoph Loch. I'm the Director or Dean of the Cambridge Judge Business School, as well as Professor of Technology and Operations Management. And I'm very happy to introduce the second interview in the Pembroke series, which aims to provide critical insight on a range of areas from both academic and practice perspectives. On behalf of the Cambridge Judge Business School, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for the generous donation that has enabled this video series, as well as PhD scholarships and the Pembroke Visiting Professor in International Finance. We are grateful for this support to enable the wider ongoing collaboration with Pembroke College, which enables us to increase capacity to contribute to current understanding of finance through teaching and collaborative research. All of that is vitally important for the university and the wider body of knowledge in the area of finance. So now I'm very pleased to introduce Lord Chris Smith, the Master of Pembroke College, Cambridge, who will moderate and host the session today. And he will also introduce our guest of honor and keynote speaker, Lord Alistair Darling. So without further ado, Lord Chris Smith, thank you very much and welcome again to everybody.
Thank you very much indeed, Christoph, a wonderful introduction. And it's a great pleasure to host this event today. A warm welcome to all of our audience. The interview will be on the subject of the economic and political consequences of COVID-19. After the interview, the discussion between myself and Alistair, we will open the floor to some questions from our audience. So do please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A tab, and we'll take as many as time will allow. We are very honoured today to be joined by Alistair Darling, Lord Darling of Roulanish, recently retired member of the House of Lords. Alistair, of course, served as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Labour government from 2007 to 2010, a time of very considerable turmoil in international finance. He was a Member of Parliament from 1987 till 2015, and he's been a member of the House of Lords in the period since then, until his retirement in July of last year. Alistair was in fact one of only 3 people to have served in the cabinet continuously from Labour's victory at the 1997 general election until the 2010 general election. For the first 4 of those, we were colleagues together in cabinet. He is probably best known, however, for his role in managing the UK economy through the global financial crisis and its immediate aftermath. He was nominated for a life peerage in the 2015 Dissolution Honours, was created Lord Darling of Roulanish of Great Bernera in the county of Ross and Cromarty on the 1st of December 2015. Welcome, Alistair, to this interview and discussion, and thank you so much for taking time to participate in the Pembroke Judge Speaker Series. This wretched pandemic that we are living through, it has caused huge distress, far too much illness and death, but it's also destroyed a lot of economic activity. It's added to spending needs as countries seek to mitigate the health and economic effects of the crisis. Do you think the fiscal response from the Treasury in the UK has been appropriate to the crisis? And if you were still Chancellor of the Exchequer, would you have done things differently?
Well, hello, and thank you for asking me to contribute to this webinar. Let me start by saying that I think that generally the measures taken by the government in response to this pandemic have been the right ones. It was critical to keep the economy going as far as we could during the pandemic, and that's got some way to run, in my view. And the measures that were introduced, particularly the job protection measures, the furlough scheme, for example, were just what was needed. Because if you're telling people you can't go to work and you've got to stay at home, and it's not their fault or anything like that, then you have to support them. I think there's a difference between what's happening now and what I had to deal with 10 years ago. Because 10 years ago, we were faced with a situation where our banks were almost collapsed completely, not just in this country, but in the States and in Europe and Japan and so on. But once we had stabilized the system, which frankly we did overnight in October of 2008, our priority the next day was to get the economy going again. Whereas the difference this time, and 2020, 2021, is that the government quite rightly was suppressing economic activity, keeping people at home. And so the business of getting the economy going again is only just beginning, and we'll maybe come back to that. But I think that as far as what the government has done, by and large, I support. I mean, I do think they were way too optimistic last summer and almost calling victory and telling people to go back to work and, that eat out to help out sort of stuff. There's a lot of evidence to suggest what happened was the virus then just, reappeared and welled up again. But as far as the economic measures are concerned, I think there's a couple of things I would have done slightly differently, but the general thrust of it, I agree with.
And in the process of dealing with this, they have built up a huge amount of government debt. How should they deal with that in the years immediately ahead of us?
I think wartime analogies can sometimes be overdone. But there's a similarity here. At the end of the First World War and at the end of the Second World War, Britain and other countries had colossal levels of debt. And actually, the debt that arose from the First World War was only repaid recently. And similarly, in the Second World War, it was still part of our debt, if you like, for the rest of the 20th century. And my view is that the accumulated debt is something that we will have to deal with over decades. It will take decades to get that level of debt down to where it was and the sort of levels we used to think about, 40%. So it will take some time to do that. The speed of it really depends on how quickly the economy recovers, whether that recovery is sustainable, what else might come along. And, that's an important point to bear in mind that, as we seek to recover from, this huge economic hit, we've got to remember, and you've actually got to err on the side of being wary on this. It could be something else will come and get us, whether it's another pandemic, whether it's a reoccurrence of this one, whether it's cyber attacks and so on. There's always going to be something you've got to be wary of. But I think that the government, and I think this is widely accepted, it needs to move towards stabilizing what you're spending and what you're taking in on the current account. But as for the debt, the accumulated deficits over over the last few years, that will take time to eliminate. And indeed, it would be quite foolish if you were to try and tackle that problem, immediately, because the effect would be you'd be suppressing the economic activity even more. And the final point I'd make is that the big unknown, I think, for all of us at the moment is just how scarred our economy will be, as eventually, we start to go back to work, because that scarring will influence what the taxable capacity of the economy is, how much revenue the government will get in, not just to deal with accumulated debts and reducing deficits. But remember, this crisis has exposed very, very starkly the product of years of cutting back on things like housing, on health, because it's no accident that the people who've really fared the worst as far as health is concerned, and as far as the death rate is concerned, that's a very high correlation with underlying levels of deprivation, of poor health, poverty. It's very, very clear, and that's not just a UK point. There's not a place in the world where you can't make exactly the same correlation.
Thinking about that developing inequality, which has been highlighted so dramatically by the impact of the pandemic. Again, if you were still Chancellor of the Exchequer, how would you set about over, say, the next 10 years, addressing the need to combat that inequality?
Well, look, the first thing that I think you need to do is to make sure that the NHS has got more resilience in it. Because frankly, 12 months ago when this hit, the NHS almost was overwhelmed, with a shortage of equipment and so on, and capacity. We've got to make sure that that resilience is there. You can't fund the NHS on a just-in-time basis. But I think the other thing that you need to look at are the underlying problems that contribute to health problems that have been there for a long, long time. And that is income levels. For example, in this country, we still have far too many people who've got absolutely no financial resilience, who struggle to make ends meet. And when they do it, they're just getting there or thereabouts. And that means addressing wage levels. We introduced the national minimum wage back in the 1990s. It was highly controversial at that time. We've now moved on to the living wage and so on. But there are still a lot of people, and you can see this today, who have got several different jobs. They may be employed for one or two, they may be self-employed for others, but they don't have any stability of income. I think you also need to look at underlying issues like housing, for example. It's no accident that where you've got people living in high density housing, having to share with maybe 1-2 other families, that's where the incidence, the spread of this virus has been most marked. So I think there's underlying issues there that need to be dealt with. There's also, there's slightly wider issues like inequality of education, therefore the opportunities available for people that you need to be looking at. And the other thing, that I should mention is that, that before the virus, there was a lot of talk about the need to level up, which generally, I take to mean in trying to ensure that those towns outside the metropolitan centres, particularly in England, are able to recover and rebuild themselves. Because a lot of them, what happened in the 80s and 90s, a lot of the people just left and they went to work for the city in cities and so on. That project is not about just building roads and railways. A road into an area that, it's lost its shops, it's lost its core industries and so on. That isn't going to sort things. It's about building up the critical mass you need in order to make towns and cities thrive again. It means good quality housing, education, making sure that these places are a good place to live. That is I would say, is a 30-year project. That's not 10 years, it's 30 years. The government hasn't yet, to my mind, shown what it's proposing to do to tackle that problem, because we are a very centralised country, the UK. Even within the nations of the UK, they are pretty centralised themselves. But this is a project that's going to take a long time. But in my view, it's necessary, not just economically, but politically too.
And now you mentioned earlier on, you led us through the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And you mentioned earlier on that there were substantial differences between what happened then and the response and what is happening now. But are there lessons that you learned during that process that you think we should be applying now?
Yeah, I think the first one that I learned is that if you're faced with a calamity like the banking system collapsing so that you couldn't get cash out, cash machines would have gone off, the doors of banks would have closed. There would have been real panic, I think, if that had happened. We got shades of that when a year before the collapse in October 2008, when you had Northern Rock and the queues you saw forming then, the first run on a bank for over 100 years. What I learned then, when I had my conversation with the then chairman of RBS, which at that time was the biggest bank in the world, and it was about the same size as the British economy. And I said, we've got a plan, we're ready to go. How long can you last? And he said, well, maybe 2 or 3 hours. You imagine what would have happened if that bank had collapsed. What I learned was that the government, put in place a huge amount of money to stabilize the banking system. The key is we did more than people thought, and we did it immediately. We did it overnight. Gordon Brown and I were able to do that because of the way that our governmental system works. We didn't need to consult with people and the rest of it. We just decided we had to go in with a very, very big response. Otherwise, it wasn't going to work. So that's the first one: do more than people expect, and do it quickly. And that applies today as much as it did 11, 12 years ago. The second thing, and this is critical, is the need for international cooperation. Shortly after that crisis in October of 2008, Gordon and I attended a meeting of the G20, the biggest economies in the world, in Washington. It's one of the last international conferences that George W. Bush held before he handed over to Barack Obama. Round that table, you had communist China, you had Republican-led United States, you had countries all over the world, different political persuasions, but they all did the same thing in reflating their economies, a classic Keynesian response of making sure that the recession that was undoubtedly coming didn't become depression as it had in the 1930s. And that international cooperation was critical. Now, if you come forward to where we are now, part of the problem for a lot of 2019 was that international cooperation was singularly lacking. Both in terms of how you respond, in terms of, the development of vaccines. You see some of the problems of that today very close to home in Europe and so on. I'm more optimistic today than I was 12 months ago about international cooperation, because I think, a pandemic reminds us we actually live on one planet. People talk about globalization, but we are in a globalized economy and actually a globalized health system, whether people like it or not. What happened on the other side of the world came across here within, a matter of months, maybe sooner than that, as we're now beginning to discover. So the international cooperation, the firepower that you need to apply immediately, those are the two big lessons that I would draw from 2008, and which, apply in slightly different ways, but they apply with as much force in 2021.
But are we, however, seeing in some of what one might call vaccine nationalism coming from some countries around the world, different responses by different nations to the pandemic, different responses both economically and in health terms? Are we seeing a bit of a fracturing of globalization as a result of all of this?
Well, I think I would say the fracturing of taking a world view, a global view, has been happening probably for the last 10 years, where you've had the growth of nationalism generally, economic nationalism, political nationalism. Whereas I firmly believe that we get on best when we cooperate with each other. It doesn't mean, giving up on things you hold dear to you, far from it. But it means, we live in one world and we need to get on with each other. I think the way I look at the current vaccination scene is this. I think amongst developed countries, it's not clear to me why the European Union has made such a difficulty for itself in actually getting supplies. If you look at the time we're talking about now, and in March of 2021, their progress is very, very slow, and that needs to concern all of us because of the movement of people. And, the fact we're only a few miles off the coast of continental Europe, whereas we, despite all the things that the government got wrong last year, actually the vaccination program is going very well, with a large proportion of the population now with their first inoculations. But let's not forget that even though things are getting better, and hopefully will get better in Europe and the United States, for example, in a large part of the world, the vaccination program has not even got off the ground yet. And that it isn't just a moral argument, or an economic argument. It's a big political argument. We've got to ensure that all parts of the world get this vaccination. Remember, for as long as one person's got it, there is a risk that it will come back, it'll mutate, something else will happen, and everyone will be affected. So it's actually in our own self-interest that we help other people. And that worries me. Never mind, the fact that we also need to look at the economic consequences for many countries that are, the developing economies, because they will be hit harder than the developed economies because they simply don't have the resilience that you need. So there's a big task here, and to my mind, this all makes the case for cooperation, and maybe things will change, but we've got a long way to go yet.
And of course, here in the UK, we're facing not just having to respond to the pandemic, but we've also got Brexit to cope with as well. How do you see those twin challenges playing out for us?
Well, look, as far as Brexit is concerned, I think that is now done. I don't see us going back into the European Union anytime soon. What I do think, and I hope, is that over time, the UK enters into more sensible relationships with its immediate next door neighbour and biggest trading partner, and one of the world's biggest trading blocs. That means, it means you've got to just get on with each other. It doesn't mean you've got to join the EU, because I don't think that's going to happen. But it means having sensible agreements and all sorts of things. At the time of speaking now, of course, things are not looking too good. Despite everything we were told, there is now effectively a barrier between Great Britain and Northern Ireland running down the Irish Sea. And far from a resolve to work together, we appear to be going in the opposite direction. Now, I think that as you look towards the recovery in the UK, Brexit is going to be a continuing problem, because if you have borders, you have barriers to trade. And that is bad for all the economies concerned. So we've got to do our best to deal with that. And of course, we haven't got any agreement at all in relation to financial services, which happen to make up the majority of our economy and affect the livelihoods, not just of people in London, but in many other financial centres, not least, Edinburgh, where I happen to live. So I think, Brexit is a big problem, and it always was going to be a big problem. I'm a Democrat. If you have a referendum and you ask a question, if you get the answer you don't like, well, that's hard luck. You've got to live with it. So I think it will have an effect, and our economy. All external, sensible external observers naturally say COVID will provide a hit, but there'll also be a hit from the consequences of Brexit. And as yet, the alleged benefits of Brexit are yet to reveal themselves, but who knows?
And the twin challenges of of course, also affecting the other big potential political issue, which is the future role of Scotland. Now, you have always been a strong advocate of Scotland remaining part of the United Kingdom. How do you see this panning out over the course of the next few years?
Well, it's interesting, the result in 2014, and I led the campaign to stay in the United Kingdom, was 55 in favour of staying, as opposed to 45 who voted for independence. Even before the pandemic, that gap has been narrowing. I think if I look at Scotland today, Scotland is split down the middle at the moment. Roughly speaking, you've probably got about 40% of people who'd vote to leave, almost all of them come what may. On the other side, you've got about 40% who will vote to stay, almost come what may. In the middle, you've got about 20%, and I'm using round numbers here, they're not the exact numbers, of people who are doubtful, have yet to make their minds and so on. And frankly, whoever wins that middle group, will win the argument at the end of the day. What's interesting is that if you look at the COVID effect, if you like, there's no doubt that throughout 2020, people were making comparisons about Boris Johnson and his presentation and Nicola Sturgeon and her presentation. And you can see all the polling shows that her presentation was seen much more favourably in Scotland, and that has undoubtedly helped form people's minds as to how they might vote were there to be another referendum. What's interesting is that if you look at politics being politics, there isn't never an equilibrium. Things happen, as they say, and there's no doubt that at the moment, the growing dispute between Alex Salmond, the former First Minister, and Nicola Sturgeon, and the battle within the SNP is beginning to cut through into public opinion. You can see that in the latest polling. For the first time, the lead of the nationalists in relation to whether we should stay or go has gone, it really emphasised the point I'm making. It's more or less level pegging. There's a slight majority of saying people that would vote to stay in the UK, but what seems to be happening is that people are looking at this argument between the two, and and thinking there's something not right here. Things are being held back. We know information is not being revealed or only revealed under duress. And that's having an effect. And, anyone who's ever, done anything political will know that once people start to think something's not right here, there's a smell about things, you pay a heavy price for that. All that brings me to my conclusion is I think you'd be brave to forecast even the results of the elections to the Holyrood Scottish Parliament in the beginning of May, let alone whether or not there would be a referendum, or let alone even further, if you had a referendum, what would the result be? I think there's too many moving parts to this, and it's pretty uncertain at the moment.
And looking more broadly across the world, the United States and elsewhere, what you have seen in recent years is a retreat from internationalism, the growth of populism, the growth of repression in some parts of the world. Is democracy in retreat? Is it under threat?
Well, I think you've always got to be vigilant. And one of the things that's also happened in the last 10 years is the willingness of people to trash institutions and trash democracy itself. And, as often, people have often said, democracy's got its problems, but it's better than all the other alternatives to it. I think, if you look in Europe, for example, it's not that long ago, actually, in 1990, that time when people thought there was a new, certainly European, if not world order, as communism came crashing down, and it looked like there was, a wave of liberalism was going to sweep across the continent. And yet today you see in parts of the European Union, people who are beginning to regress back to this, the sort of mindset that allowed communism to rule in certainly the eastern part of Europe for a long time. In the United States, you've had a very, the last election was very contested, and the result was actually quite close. Though there's no doubt that I think that the arrival of President Biden has changed politics in the United States, and certainly people's worldview, because I think he's more of the school of, yes, of course, he'll stick up for America. That's his job. But he's also got a realistic view of the fact you've got to work with other people within the world. And America has massive power and soft power as well as hard power as well. And, within the UK, Brexit is English nationalism to a very large extent. And, it's divided the country, not just in England, but in the rest of the United Kingdom. And of course, in the other side of the world, you've got China asserting itself in a way that is different to what was going on, 10 or 15 years ago. Having said all that, I think at the end of the day, I'm optimistic that despite the fact that there will be bad things happening and from time to time, I'm optimistic that if people can seize the opportunity, we can get back to a position where, frankly, people recognise we may have our differences and our own self-interest from time to time, but we cannot exist on this planet if we don't cooperate with each other. And that applies to economics, it applies to the climate change threat, it applies to the whole question of peace and stability. So I'm more optimistic now than, as I said earlier, than I would have been 12 months ago.
Now, a final question from me before we throw questions open to the floor. We're talking here with an audience of students in the university here in Cambridge, young people, either about to graduate or who've very recently graduated. What advice or suggestions might you have for a young, about to graduate audience about what they should try and make of the future?
Well, I think the single best advice would believe in yourself, believe in your abilities. It is a difficult jobs market you're going into. You know, when Chris and I graduated, 45 years ago, it was difficult not to get a job. You know, you knew you'd have a job. You weren't worried about it. Now, of course, we've gone through waves because there's been generations who graduated in the 1980s, for example, you know, who faced very real difficulties. You know, today, you know, there will be opportunities. You know, the world is changing very quickly. Technology is changing things, the way in which we deal with each other. There are huge opportunities, and you know, for students leaving university just now, you know, the quality of education you've had is good. It's world class in many cases. You know, you have a lot to give. You may have to be patient at times. You may not get the thing that you want the first time or even the second time, but just have belief in your own abilities and have confidence in yourself. And you know, look after the man or woman next to you as well. You know, take a broad world view, and you'll do okay.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed. We've touched on a range of really interesting issues, some of which I suspect will come up from the floor as well. But I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Simon Taylor, who is going to moderate the question and answer session for us. Simon, over to you.
Thank you and hello. My name's Simon Taylor. I'm a faculty in management practice in finance at Cambridge Judge Business School, and it's my pleasure to moderate the Q&A session today. We've had some questions already, but if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Can we start, Alistair, with a question that's come in? What do you see as the key challenges for business and government to work together in future? And are we facing a crisis in our capitalist system?
Look, there's always a crisis in capitalism. You know, there has been all my life, and there probably will be all through the lives of everybody watching this. But you know, nobody's come up with a better system generally for regulating our affairs. You know, I think one of the things that may change is that people, I think, have recognised, especially in the last 12 months or so, that governments do have a role. You know, they can get it. You know, they've got a role. They can, the way in which they discharge that role can be better or it can be worse, as the case may be. But you know, at the end of the day, this crisis has shown that the government is certainly the lender of last resort. Is also the insurer of last resort and can be the provider in many cases of last resort, you know, when things go wrong. My view is government is there to provide a framework to allow individuals and businesses to do the best they can. It's not to stand in the shoes of those individuals or businesses and, you know, and second guess their judgments and so on. But I think, you know, I was talking earlier in reply to a question about, you know, the challenges that the government faces. Most businesses, as well as individuals, recognise the fact that if you don't have a functioning infrastructure, for example, you know, a railway system to ensure that you've got access to broadband, to ensure you've got high quality education, to turn out, you know, well qualified and motivated people, a health service that's there if things go wrong. If you don't have that infrastructure, then business will suffer as much as anybody else does. So it's not choosing between public and private sector, government or businesses. You have to work together. And you know, as I say, there will always be arguments about the detail or how fair the distribution of these things are. But I think, you know, perhaps there will be a recognition now that you know, if things go wrong, you do actually need a functioning and competent government. Albeit I fully accept there are times when it doesn't function terribly well, and there are times when it doesn't terribly look very competent.
You talked earlier, you referred to the need for more resilience in the NHS. And we've had a couple of questions connected with the NHS, which I'll tie together. One is a very short-term one in the sense of, do you agree with the government's proposal for a 1% pay rise to NHS workers? And then the other question is more about the long term. The UK, like most countries, has an aging population. Healthcare costs are inevitably going to rise. What does that mean for the fiscal position? Is it something that we just have to manage, or do we need some new approach to make that feasible?
Right. Well, look, on the first one, I don't know why this government's got a habit of walking into self-made, presentational disasters. It's like the school meals in holiday time. Took a Manchester United football star to get them to change their minds. I think in relation to nurses in the NHS, I would just make this point that. People were very happy to come out and clap for the NHS in the early part of last year. You really need to back that up. I think, particularly the frontline staff, to offer them 1% is, I just don't think that's the right thing to do. What I would say is, I would not make a generalised comment about this in the NHS. Frankly, there are people in the NHS, consultants and so on, who I don't think would quibble about getting, a lower pay rise because, some of them are quite well paid already. But a lot of the nursing staff and certainly a lot of support staff who make the NHS work, the people that meet you at the front door, the people who are making everything go on, I just think the government has got itself into a difficulty of its own making, and I think the majority of people would share that view. Oh, sorry, you're asking about how to pay for the NHS generally. There's no special way of paying for the NHS. It's there's only one way. It's called taxation. And if you want an NHS, then you have to be willing to pay for it. At the beginning of this century, I think it was 2001, Gordon Brown, increased national insurance by 1%, specifically to go to the NHS, making the point that we weren't spending enough on it, not just because of the the fact that we need to do that on a day-to-day basis, but if you look at the demographic changes in this country with people living longer, if you look at the treatments that are now available that weren't available a few years ago. You're not talking about outrageous sums. You're just talking about making sure that it's adequately funded. But there is no other way other than taxation. That's why we pay taxes to get public services. There's no mystique in that. And anyone tells you there's a fancy way of paying for it, I think is, frankly, they're misleading you.
Now, a number of people have asked questions about inequality and unfairness. So one person, for example, cites Lord Willett's idea that there's, even before the pandemic, there was a kind of intergenerational unfairness in the UK, which arguably has been made even worse. And other people have referred to the inequality in terms of job security or the lack of it. Do you agree the pandemic has made these things worse? And if so, what can we do about them?
Yeah, it certainly has made things worse. If you look at who's fared the worst in terms of health, in addition to the housing and health problems I referred to earlier, it tends to be people who had to go to work. They can't work from home. They're driving buses or taxis, and they're already on low incomes. I think that the second thing is that there's a recent survey of how people have fared financially, which shows that about 2 million people have lost quite some significant sums of money because they're not getting the furlough help, they're not getting the self-employed help. But typically they will either have different sorts of jobs. I said earlier, maybe a self-employed job, maybe a job that's part-time where they're employed and so on, but they just don't have anything to fall back on. Now, so that if you like has been one of the byproducts of the failures in the COVID support scheme. But even before you started that, what has worried me, for the last 10 years or so, we have got a generation of people who are, living, an existence where they don't have any permanent work. The gig economies, it's commonly referred to, where they simply are not. They're barely getting enough money to make ends meet. let alone get resilience for the future. Sometimes they might lose their jobs or become ill, let alone saving for their pension, which they will need. And, they could live, a long time, after their retirement. So that is a problem that I think we need to attend to, even if we hadn't had COVID. There is that rising generation, and most of these people I'm describing are younger. On top of that, you've got, one of the things that another imbalance that's been building up over the last 10 years or so, you've got a younger generation coming out of universities and schools and so on. They've got the student debt. They will, unlike my generation where you were expected and you could buy a house when you were in your 20s, most people will not have a hope of doing that, for some considerable time, maybe the 30s or even the 40s. On top of that, as their generation starts to get into work, they will be having to pay more taxes to pay for the pensions of my generation, who are living, as I say, longer than they were. And at the same time, we've had measures, the triple lock, as it's called, which guarantees, quite a good rise in the pension, which is not accompanied by help for people who are at the other end of their lives. So yes, this intergenerational challenge has been there for some time, but the virus is probably accentuating the effects of that, and it's something the government needs to attend to, because it's not just unfair. It's actually very it's bad for the economy. The next generation may benefit from their parents' big houses when they sell them, but the generation after that will not be able to do that. So this is a problem that needs to be fixed.
And some people have put forward the idea, again, before the pandemic, perhaps now with more emphasis, that part of the solution to these problems will be a universal basic income. Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, I've yet to see any studies where it's actually worked. I mean, there's been pilots carried out, and the conclusions have been pretty mixed. But I've always found a difficulty in saying, well, what level should it be? And if you put it at a level that is adequate to enable someone to survive without having to work, then it does beg the question, well, why should you work? Obviously, some people will want to do better than that, but I would like to see some evidence, and I haven't seen any evidence. I've seen lots of people talk about it, and it makes the stuff of good seminars and webinars, but I've yet to see any evidence that would make me, commit myself to it.
Now, a question that perhaps you will find rather depressing, but how likely do you think it is that we will face another global financial crisis, given that we've seen a huge increase in government debt recently, but even before that, a big rise in debt? And a lot of people think that financial assets generally are quite highly valued. Are you worried about where this all leads?
Yeah. I don't think you will see a repeat of what you saw 10 years ago, but it's important to remember what the problem was 10 years ago. You had a large number of banks that were very seriously undercapitalized and nothing to fall back on. And you also had a situation where they were taking on risks that they simply didn't understand. That said, you always have to be vigilant. I mean, that's what the regulatory system's there for. Banks do hold a lot more capital than they did then. I think there are better controls around. I think you raise a broader issue about how confident are markets or people who buy government bonds in the ability of the people who issue those bonds to pay them. I think that I don't think that's an immediate problem, but it does point to the fact that although it will take time to sort these things out, as long as governments seem to be making progress there, then I think that that's not something that is keeping me awake at night. What I think is, actually the bigger problems that I see, and since it's not new anything like that, is that if somebody really wants to have a go at the banking system, a cyber attack, or the threat that's always been around, bioterrorism and so on. But as you can see, over the last few years, there are people, and not, these tend not to be individuals, but, sometimes state-sponsored groups who are increasingly finding ways of getting into people's computer systems, which could have exactly the same effect as, someone taking on a whole bunch of risky assets. So there's always risk. We always need to be vigilant. But I come back to one of the points I've made a number of times during this webinar, and that it needs cooperation. If we're talking about cyber attacks, you need international cooperation. You need cooperation between big institutions because they all know what they're looking for. And sometimes there's been a reticence to confess that actually there's a problem in the system. But as we can see, almost on a weekly basis, someone is having a go at something somewhere, and that's why that is the thing that bothers me rather more than will you have a rerun of something that happened 10 or 12 years ago. You've got to watch you don't try and fight the last war.
A couple of people have said, are we in fact in danger of having too much stimulus this time? There have been some debates about the size of the bill in the process of being passed in the United States, but are we actually in danger now of seeing too much government support, which could lead to a return of inflation?
Well, I know that's a concern. It's probably more of a concern on the other side of the Atlantic than it is here at the moment. My view is that you should err on the side of doing more rather than less. One of the mistakes that the coalition government made in the UK after they took power in 2010 was they embarked on the austerity programme, and they started taking too much money out of the economy too soon. And they weren't the only ones. That mood took hold in the European Union, for example, whereas if it hadn't been from the intervention of Mario Draghi and the European Central Bank and the commitment to do whatever it took through monetary policy, using that central bank, Europe would have been in a very difficult position. And indeed, if you look at the economic growth in the European Union over the last 10 years, it has been very, very, subdued, slow. So I think that is partly because they have a problem with internal fiscal transfers between the richer countries and the poorer countries, but also because the dominant view within the European Union was that fiscal policy, the stimulus, didn't have much of a role to play. And I think there's a limit to what you could do with monetary policy and quantitative easing. It's there for emergency treatment. It's not something you should have in perpetuity. And similarly, in the United States, I think President Biden is quite right to go in. As I said earlier, if you want to create a firewall, if you want to get things going, you sometimes have to do far more than people expect. So I'm with him in saying that you should look at that. There are mechanisms that can be brought into play if inflation does appear. That's what the US Fed is there for. That's what the Bank of England's here for in the UK. So I think that the greater risk to me would be if you get your foot off the pedal too soon. Because those of you who are around in the 1980s will know that what happens then when you get huge structural unemployment, where people don't go back to work, they go onto disability benefits, their children don't work, and everything spirals in a downward direction, and we must avoid that at all costs.
Yes, I was an economics student in the early 1980s. I remember it well, and it was a pretty miserable time. Now, one of the things that's happened in the last year has been a big shift towards online retailing, an acceleration of an existing trend. And one of the questions is, does this mean we have to rethink taxation? A lot of retailers feel that the current system is unfair, the way the business rates are levied and so forth. So do you think we have to rethink the way we treat online activities?
Well, this rate, again, this problem is not new, although it's being brought into sharp focus now about how you tax online activities. And we've had the problems, for example, of online sales being routed through Luxembourg. And claiming that's where the product was generated, and that reduces the taxes that especially the multinational online traders use. That they're truly global, but they don't seem to have anywhere where they stop and put their foot down and pay taxes. Yeah, that's a problem that's got to be dealt. It's been building for a long time. And if you ask, here obviously I'm talking about the UK. I think the high street problem, if I can use that term, again, it's been one that's growing. People have got, are getting used to and have got used to online shopping. And that's why, the big old department stores that used to be on every high street are struggling, and, many of them are gone and they just won't come back. I think that does mean to me that the whole question of business rates need to be looked at. Every government for, years, our own included, has said we must look at business rates. I do know that local government taxation is fraught with difficulties. Again, in the 1980s, people remember that the one big attempt to change the way in which local government was funded was called the poll tax, which will probably mean that no one will touch it again for another 100 years. But I think that business taxation is, you've got a situation where some businesses are paying more tax than a luxury flat above them. That's something that needs to be looked at. I think what's on a high street is going to change anyway. But one of the things we do need to look at is the taxation. And taxation is, people will pay their taxes. We've got to think it's fair, which means everybody's paying their fair share, whether you're a multinational online, seller, whether you're, a shop on the high street, or whether you're an individual.
Earlier, you talked about the levelling up idea and the question of centralisation, and we heard in the budget some form of support for carefully chosen towns across the UK. But I wonder how far you think that a fundamental problem is the concentration of decision making, particularly within England now, given that we've had devolution to the other parts of the UK. And that, is there a problem here with the Treasury? It's often said that the Treasury simply doesn't like to give away, particularly the power to raise taxes. But without that, local governments don't really have power and discretion, and therefore things don't get done in the right way. Do you agree?
Well, I don't think it's a Treasury problem per se. I mean, the Treasury is led by the Chancellor of the day, who happens to be an MP. It should therefore, as most of them in recent past haven't come from London, they ought to be able to look at what's going on in their area and then say what's the policies that are best, rather than just looking at it from inside the four walls of Her Majesty's Treasury. I do think there is a problem in relation to the powers and the relationship between the assemblies and the parliaments in the UK that needs to be looked at. I think there is a special problem in England where decision making is very centralised. And if you look at some of the stuff that was happening last year, in relation to Manchester and the northwest of England, for example, I think that needs to be looked at. What I think is, in England, you're not, the days of regional assemblies and so on, I think that's long behind us. I do think that one of the models that has worked in the UK actually is how some of the big English cities and British cities actually have reinvented themselves. I'll give you two examples. Glasgow and Manchester were built off Britain's industrial past, the Industrial Revolution. They both suffered in the post-war years and became quite run down. And yet, they reinvented themselves in the 80s and 90s. They're now vibrant cities. But the key is they were built around a core of world-class universities, financial services, other industries that were going. They created an atmosphere. It was a nice place to live. People wanted to be there. A sense of things happening. The media were in both those cities. I think what you need to do, if you want to do the same for the smaller English towns, is you've got to try and build, a nucleus, something you can build around, a reason for people to be there. As I said earlier, building a road into a place, it doesn't do the trick. You need far more than that, which is why I say this is a long-term project. It's not something you can easily fix. But I think the governance of the UK generally, it needs to be looked at. In different parts of the country, there are different problems. For obvious reasons, breaking up the UK is not the answer to it. It'll make a bad situation even worse. I mean, if you think leaving the EU was a mistake, from where I'm sitting, it seems to me to be 100 times worse if you go further and break us away from the rest of the UK. But don't kid ourselves, there's a problem here. And it's got to be looked at from the eyes of, why don't we turn the telescope round the other way? Look at it from outside London rather than happens too often. As I say that as somebody who's in government, which patently, exists largely around Whitehall, too often you look at the rest of the country from London. That's not a great way to make any decision.
If I can extend this point about some of these challenges requiring a long-term, a multi-decade solution, Are we set up for that kind of policy making? I mean, there's been a lot of talk in the misery of the last year about building back better and using this as an opportunity to permanently improve various aspects of the economy and our society. But do we have a governance system that somehow is always geared towards the short term? It's just not very good at dealing with those longer term challenges.
Well, it can be. I'm not sure how you get around that problem, because I think you must have elections every 4 or 5 years. You can't possibly say, well, we'll leave you there for the next 30. In my experience, and there's lots of evidence, and we don't have to look around too far to see it, once governments have been in power for a long time, problems start to arise. So that isn't the answer. And cross-party consensus is fine, though it can be sometimes difficult to put in place. But I mentioned what happened in some of the English cities. That's been happening for the last 30 years. It's a long-term project, and obviously things can be done better. You can make improvements and so on. Or if you take one of my many jobs in the government once was the Secretary of State for Transport. I remember signing off for example, Crossrail, which I'm ready to be the first to admit it's not built yet. But it's almost, hopefully, almost there. But it's an example of something that spanned at least 3 or 4 governments to do these things. So it is possible to look ahead, without saying to a government, "Okay, you can stay there in perpetuity." The key thing is to get public support. What worries me is, I listened to the budget last week. I was hearing a little bit too much that we're doing this now for the next couple of years or so, but we're going back to where we were beforehand. That won't do. We've done that, and we've seen the consequences of it. But it does take the public to vote for governments that are prepared to take that long-term view, even if that government may not be around when actually we see the fruition of these policies. But maybe that's hoping for too much.
A question here from a colleague, so I'm happy to put this forward. What do you think of the success of the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, and following Brexit, where the rules and the scope for change in our competition policy is now there? Do you think its role should change, or we should rethink competition policy?
I don't see a need for a radical rethink of competition policy. At the moment, of course, since we've left the EU, there's all sorts of things like state aid and things that we've got to start looking at, and how do you apply it here? But I think the CMA has, by and large, has operated well. I know there is a lot of criticism around, not least from the person who was going to chair it, but had decided that they didn't want to. Of all the problems I see in the UK at the moment, I'm afraid that this doesn't figure very highly in my mind. Not because I don't think it's an important thing, because it is important, but it may need adjustment, but I don't think it needs a complete overhaul.
Well, one final question, and it's on the connection really to how we emerge out of the pandemic and the policy on climate change, and more broadly on sustainability. There are a lot of things going on in this area, and a lot of people are changing their behavior. But how do you think we get sustainability and climate change policy really firmly into the centre of public policy coming out of the pandemic?
Well, I think the mood is changing, and the test will be, how do we all behave as we emerge from this? And of course, we've got the summit, the COP26 summit that's due to take place in Glasgow at the end of this year, hopefully, where governments need to sign up to substantially more than they signed up to last time they met in Paris. I would like to see, far more being done to implement the actual steps that we need to take to reduce our dependence on carbon, in relation to housing, in relation to transport. What actually are we going to be doing? There's some things that are useful steps ahead, in relation to, electric cars and so on. But, frankly, if you look at the amount of carbon that's emitted through the generation of heat, for example, we're still a long way away from having anything that looks like a program that would actually deliver on that. And perhaps yet again, and this is probably where we're nearing the end. This again is an example of where you need to convince not just people in our country, but in other countries, in other parts parts of the world that they need to be doing the same thing, because this is something you can't do within one country alone. But it needs the political will. And again, it's like so much we've been talking about. None of this is a year or two ahead or 5 years ahead. This is a long-term project. But, we do have a chance now, while people's minds are focused on it, and asking ourselves, what in practical terms do we actually need to do now if we're going to hit the targets that we're fixing over the next 20 or 30 years?
Well, Alistair, thank you so much for answering such a wide range of questions in a wonderfully frank and open way. Thank you. We really appreciate it. And now I'm going to Christoph Loch to conclude proceedings. Thank you.
So I would like to sincerely thank you, Alistair Darling, for taking the time to speak with us and for sharing your insight and experience. If you allow me, three things struck me. Your statement that if you want the NHS, you have to pay taxes. I think it's a frank statement, and I know many people who at the moment would not be willing to make that statement, but it's so true. I very much liked that you said that you are more optimistic now than you were 12 months ago. That gives me a little bit of a reassurance. And another thing that struck me was that you several times emphasized that some of these issues are really issues of international cooperation. They go beyond country borders. I think these are very, very important points. There were many more important points, but these are three that particularly struck me. It has been a real honor to have you here, to connect with you, and we greatly appreciate you participating in the Pembroke Speaker Series at Cambridge Judge in International Finance. Thank you very much again. And also a big thank you to Lord Chris Smith and Dr. Simon Taylor for moderating this session. And of course, as always, a big thank you to all of you who have joined us today. Thank you again, and goodbye.